call the meeting of the Carson City Planning Commission for May 31st, 2017 to order. Would the secretary call the roll, please?
Chairperson Eswine.
Here.
Vice Chair Sattler.
Here.
Commissioner Borders.
Here.
Commissioner Green.
Here.
Commissioner Monroy. Commissioner Salerno.
Here.
A quorum's present.
Thank you. Mr. Sattler, would you lead us in the pledge, please? Would you rise for the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
At this time, the public is invited to comment on and discuss any topic that is relevant to or within the authority of the Planning Commission, including any matter that is not specifically included on the agenda as an action item. Is there anyone here who wishes to address the Commission on something that's not going to be discussed later during the regular meeting? Okay, we will move on to the next item, which is approval of the minutes of April 26, 2017. Has everybody had an opportunity to review those?
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion we accept the minutes as presented.
Okay, we have a motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second by Mr. Sattler. Any further discussion on the minutes? All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? We have one absent and one vacancy on the commission. Item D, modification of the agenda. Items on the agenda may be taken out of order. The public body may combine two or more agenda items for consideration, and the public body may remove an item from the agenda or delay discussion relating to an item on the agenda at any time. Mr. Plemmel, are there any changes?
No, Mr. Chairman, we plan on taking the items in the order on the agenda.
Okay, thank you. Any commissioners have any changes, modifications? Item E, disclosures. Any member of the commission may wish to explain any contact with an applicant or the public regarding an item on the agenda or business of the commission. Are there any disclosures? Okay. Item F, we will recess as the Planning Commission and call to order the Growth Management Commission. Can we dispense with the roll call on this item?
Mr. Chairman, I think just for purposes of the minutes, it would be better for a roll call to be called.
Would the
Chairperson
secretary call the
Eswine.
roll? Here.
Vice Chair Sattler.
Here.
Commissioner Borders.
Here.
Commissioner Green.
Here.
Commissioner Monroy. Commissioner Salerno.
Here.
A quorum's present.
Thank you. Public comment. The public is invited at this time to comment on and to discuss any topic that is relevant to or within the authority of the Growth Management Commission, including any matter that is not specifically included on the agenda as an action item. Is there anyone who wishes to address the Growth Management Commission on an item that's not included in our agenda? Okay. Moving on to item 3, approval of minutes of May 25th, 2016. Oh, that's why we had that. Okay. I was reading those for the public, for the Growth Management Commission stuff. Have those minutes have already been approved, though, as Planning Commission, isn't that correct?
All right, we're discussing with the legal requirements on approving the minutes for the Growth Management Commission, which you act as. So through the minutes.
Mr. Chairman, let me just weigh in here. So my understanding, based on some behind-the-scenes discussion here over at this table, is that those minutes were already approved and adopted at a previous meeting. If that's the case, we can dispense with the adoption this time around. It's already been taken care of, is my understanding.
That was my impression.
Okay.
Thank you. So we will move on to public hearing matters. Item 4A, GM-17-045 for possible action to recommend to the Board of Supervisors a resolution establishing the maximum number of residential building permit allocations under the Growth Management Ordinance for the years 2018 and 2019, and estimating the maximum number of residential building permits for the years 2020 and 2021. Establishing the number of building permit allocations within the development and general property owner categories, and establishing a maximum average daily usage for commercial and industrial building permits as a threshold for Growth Management Commission review. Mr. Plemmel.
Good evening. For the record, Lee Plemmel, Community Development Director. I'll be giving the presentation on this. This is the one growth management item on the agenda tonight. I'll be giving an overview of the report. You'll be making recommendations to the board. To assist me with the presentation tonight, I have Darren Schultz, the Public Works Director. Tied in with my presentation, he'll be giving a presentation on the status of and projections for water and sewer capacity. We also have with us tonight some representatives from the school district, and also have planned a presentation on their plans for accommodating growth, and also, as with others, that struggles with accommodating growth in the upcoming years. I know also we have in the audience with us Fire Chief Slayman, if you have any questions of the fire department. And that's without looking back. And I think we have some others here too, so we'll try to answer your questions as they come up. But let me start by saying the fact that we have growth management that actually limits has a cap on the number of building permits at any given year is actually relatively rare across the country. You know, Douglas County has fairly recently implemented it. They used ours as a model. I'm not aware of any others in the state of Nevada that have such a limitation or the ability to limit. So, and I know there are other places across the country. It certainly has been upheld as a constitutional as constitutional in terms of the legal requirements of it, as long as there's a compelling government interest involved in your limiting the number of permits. But so you actually have quite a unique and difficult task actually in coming up with the number every year to deal with the growth pressures in Carson City. So with that, let me launch into a little bit of information. As I said, you know, some of the specifics you need to do is actually set the number of residential permits for residential units the following year. So we're talking primarily what we're talking about is 2018. There's some other things in the ordinance, but you review it every year. So really think about this, the total number of units for next calendar year, 2018. Within that, there's also a developer and general property owner category, with developers being those with 32 or more units, and everybody else pulls out of the general category. And there's also some more detail to that as noted in the staff report. And then also establishing for commercial projects, growth management for residential is the number of units. For commercial, it's a threshold on a per project basis of the average daily water usage, how much water is being used, above which it's not a limit, but above which requires growth management, this commission's review of the project, which largely involves Public Works involvement in looking at the water capacity issues of the specific development. So with that, annually, I provide some information for you, so I'd like to go through some of that. That's the wrong button to hit, this one. This is a chart going back to the beginning of, is it the beginning? Yeah, that goes back to the beginning of growth management in the late 70s when it was started in Carson City. Initially, it was based on lack of the infrastructure to support the growth that was occurring for water and sewer capacity. And there was there was agreement between the city and the state. This was implemented to limit it and make sure that those type of infrastructures facility were keeping up with the pace of growth. So that was the initial purpose of it being implemented. The chart up there shows the black line being the number of allocations that have been made available every year for residential units, and the lower line, those that have actually are the number of permits that have been pulled in those same years. So as you can see, obviously, we're towards the right of the chart now. We went through the recession of almost 10 years now in terms of on this growth management chart, where we were very low, historically low every year for the last few years until last year. And this year's on pace to exceed last year. Last year was approaching 200, wasn't quite 200. But I think this also shows, looking at this, so this is a pretty long time span, going back to 1978 on this chart. And there's a good almost 20-year period kind of in the middle of there where the city was over 300 units every year. So it's not, while it's new in the last decade to have the kind of growth we're seeing now, the kind of the number of permits we're seeing, we're still below kind of what historic growth has been in Carson City. This is a shorter time frame up to recent, beginning in 1996, just because that's when I have the data for this, but it's by unit type, and with the upper checked area is multifamily, the yellow is the yellow base is single family detached units, and there's some other mix in between there, but you can see we've had a mix of products over the years. And again, obviously, these up until last year, we had a number of years that was very low. But you can see in the past, we've had up to close to 300 units of single family plus other multifamily per year. And I would say this is what you're allocating is building permits pool. And I would note that within this chart, there's certainly some that were not built. These were allocations that were pulled. So this was demand for the allocation. And I'm thinking particularly in 2006 here, where there was a little spike before the recession, there was a number of multifamily projects in particular that got their permits, but as things crashed, they never proceeded, so they were never built. This is a little bit of another way of looking at it. So the chart on the left is existing residential units by type currently in all of Carson City, or at least in 2016 per assessor's data by type. So with the yellow being your basic traditional single-family detached housing unit, mobile homes is the whitish area, and then multifamily is the orange area, with the single-family attached being a single for-sale product, but another attached product. So you can see that's the makeup of all the residences in Carson City now. And since 2000, the chart on the right is how many permits have been issued by those different types since 2000. The proportion obviously is skewed a little bit more towards multifamily over the last 15, 17 years now. And again, going back to the current stock is about 75% total. That's between the mobile home and single family detached. That's a detached product. Everything else is some sort of attached product. And then more recently, the permits are a little bit less than that, about 68, 70% have been single family detached type of product. This is data regarding home sales. So this is not a rental. This is just a home sales data chart, with the top part being since 2004, the number of home sales over the years, and the bottom part being the median sales price for each of those categories, and with the blue line on there is the median for all. The top yellow line is the median sales price for single family homes. Again, as prices go up, you have the home builders make more profit. They want to build more. As the prices go up, though, then affordability can become an issue. Just looking up today, the median household income in Carson City for a household is around $50,000. So that's the median, and a household earning that kind of an affordable house for that income is in about the $180,000 range or somewhere around there. So you can see as our median household sales price for single family has gone up over $300,000 so far this year. That's based on low volume so far this year, but that's the highest it's been in actually probably ever, going back to pre-recession levels, but that's only with partial year data. And so what is growth? Where are we going in Carson City with the master plan in terms of projected growth? Well, this is the population going back to 1985 with the certified population from the demographer's office in blue. A lot of their population estimates are obviously based not just housing starts, but on how many jobs are here. So people kind of migrate in and out based on jobs. So there was a period during the recession where we were flat and even just a little bit going down. It's coming back up. The black line on there is the demographer's projections going out for the next 15 years or so, 15, 20 years. Projections change based on the current economy and things. So in the past, I've kind of had a one line for the city projection, kind of put two there, a low projection and a high projection, thinking we'll based on historic trends, we'll be somewhere within that range, which puts us out to a build-out population, both in terms of land use, basic land use capacity under our current master plan, and also looking at our water and sewer capacity resources of about 75,000. With that build-out, depending on, again, on how fast building permits actually come in, occurring some 30 to 50 years from now. So with growth management, there is, so this is a list of all the of currently approved subdivisions and multifamily apartments. So this is so-called approved projects. So remember, there's a distinction between, you've seen a lot of tentative maps. We have some tonight that are tentative maps. That means it's approval to then create lots to build homes of some kind of another on there, or approval by special use permit to build apartments. You have currently between between residential projects, both detached and attached, and other multifamily projects. On this list now, there's, let's say, roughly 2,000 in the list. That's actually not that unusual. I mean, pre-recession, we had about 3,000, but that's different than actual number of permits. That's not, these are approved. That doesn't mean they're going to be built in the next year or 2 or 5, so in some cases even 10 years when you start looking at larger projects like the Lampa Ranch. So growth management that we're talking about today is the tool that regulates the number of units that come in any given year. Even these multifamily projects have multiple buildings that are phased in. They don't build 300 at once. Arbor Villas is on here. That was one that was approved last year. They've come in with the first phase of 50 some odd units. They'll build those. They'll move on to the next phase when those are sold. That's how the pace of development works. The pace of development is based on the sales of homes. The builders are not gonna build the next home till they sell the last one. I mean, they do that in groups generally. There's a number of those going on, but that's kind of the basic premise. But this list, the projects that we have now, which total about, let me see it, given the numbers to it that are legible down there, about this approved subdivision lots with phases remaining to be recorded is a little over 1,400, and right now approved apartment units pending construction is a little over 600, so it's a little over 2,000 total. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to, just briefly before I turn it over to Darren to go over the water and sewer. This is from the growth management ordinance, the items that the Planning Commission and Board is to consider when making the recommendation on the allocations. Again, it started off in the late 70s, and for a long time it was just water and sewer, and it was actually, I think it was actually in the last 10 years that these other things that you're to consider have been added. And so, of course, you have with you, we send out, when we start this at the beginning of the month, we send out notification to all the affected agencies, city departments, school district, and get back and get comments back that are included in your packet. So with the first one on the list is city water, and at this point I'll turn it over to Darren Schultz, Public Works Director, to talk to you about water and answer any questions you have on water. Let me switch over to the presentation.
Good evening. Thanks. Darren Schultz, Public Works Director, for the record. We're going to primarily be talking about water for this presentation. That's what we prepared today. In the memo that was sent in that Lee will talk about next is all the other divisions within Public Works. Water obviously gets the most attention. A little bit about Carson City's water system. It's, for a small water system, it's extremely complex. You will not see this in other areas. And it has a lot to do with the difference in elevation across Carson City, east to west and north to south for that matter. To have 23 pressure zones, that's a lot. So we're constantly boosting the pressure of water up, and then on the other side we're reducing it down so that homeowners, they don't get their water pressure is relatively consistent. Includes storage tanks, wells, one treatment plant, an arsenic treatment plant. We're tied in with Douglas County to the south, regional water line, and a lot of water pipes that are underground. This is just an overview graph. The different colors represent the different pressure zones within our city. So as you can see, right in the middle, in the heart, relatively consistent, but then as soon as you go out and you get a little change in elevation, then it starts tweaking our system. In terms of our strategy and production, these are the four main goals that we do. The idea is we're going to increase supply to meet the demand. That's really what we're here to talk about tonight. We always want to increase our surface water capture. The more we can do with surface water, the less we have to mine from the ground. That's a good thing. So we're always looking for the low-hanging fruit in terms of surface water. It's been a really wet year, so we anticipate getting more surface water this year than we did the last 5-year drought, where we had to use a lot of well water. That leads into the decreased groundwater pumping. The more we can not pump the groundwater, the more it can stay down there, and we can use it for when droughts do happen. And then strategic recharge is putting it back in the groundwater. Our regional water system, our pipeline that we put in, this is just an overview graph. Some of you would be familiar with it. So it starts out down in Minden, comes north, comes into Carson, through Douglas County into Carson City. It does connect over to Lyon County. And right now we are connected here in Carson City. We're using our allotment of water, and we're in the process of moving it further to the west across the city. So the regional water line now stops just on the other side of Carson Street, just on the west side at Phillips, and the plan is to continue that from Phillips all the way up to the west, the Quill water treatment plant. So those phases are coming in the upcoming years to build it. Once it's built to there, then we can move that water throughout our system entirely. The whole goal is to blend, use water from there to blend with our wells that are high in arsenic or high in uranium, so that we can use that water as well. In terms of that project in the future, what we're doing with it, it's multiple phases. Like I just explained, we're at Phillips. We got to continue going up to the west side. There will be a tank built and a booster pump station built as part of that project, and eventually we'll tie in with the Quill water treatment plant up on the west slopes there. In the future, should the demand be there where we need to get additional water from Minden, Douglas County, there's various projects that we have scoped out on the books, engineered, that they'll work. It's just a matter of pulling the trigger when it's time to do that. We don't see that in the next probably decade. In terms of this last year, what we did in our usage was we used 65% from the groundwater and 35 surface water. As you're aware, we had a pretty wet winter, and so that really helps out here. Anytime we can, we're trying to, like I said, use surface water. So as part of growth management, we talk a lot about what our water rights are in terms of Carson City. One thing that we did a number of years ago was the city went out and acquired the water rights necessary for full build out of Carson City. So what that means is when a developer comes and wants to put a project in here, they don't have to bring their own water rights as part of the project. We already own enough water rights to sustain the build out of Carson City. So right now we have just over 18,000 acre feet. That number goes up a little bit as certain individual owners have them to sell. We might look at it, but we're not really in the market to buy more because we don't need more. We have enough for the build out of Carson City. So moving forward, our estimation of projects that we currently have on the books that have been are in some level of approval, we have a commitment of 1,445 acre feet that we're committed to. So if you take our usage that we have of the 11,000, you take that off of what we have available, that leaves us a balance of 5641 acre feet of water rights that are totally uncommitted at this point in Carson City. This is a graph that just shows what the max day demand is on our water system. So now you need to stop thinking about the water rights that we have. You can check that box. Now we move on to what is the demand when people turn on their faucets, turn on their sprinklers, how much water do we need to apply at once? This gives you a graph of what's been going on over the last few years. This past year, our max day was 20 million gallons a day, 20.22. So as you can see, that's going down from previous years. That has to do with conservation. It also has to do with wet weather. The number one demand on our system, obviously, is irrigation. The difference between summer water demand and winter water demand, it's about 70-30% difference in terms of how much we have to produce. So it's really a big difference. Projecting out, the red line up there is where we are right now with our current system in a drought, how much water we could supply on a given day, just under 25 million gallons. Those other lines reflect the max day average is yellow, and then if we're in wet years, we're bumping up against 30. So we keep an eye, obviously, on what's going on with weather, climate change, to make sure we're in a position that we can provide water. That number, in terms of what we can provide, we can move those lines up depending on infrastructure that we want to build in our system to supply more water. So some of those things I talked about earlier in the regional water system, kicking on new projects or that are part of that would boost those lines up to where we could produce more water and supply it to our customers. So what we're recommending is the 15,000 gallons per day threshold, which means somebody can come in if they don't go higher than that, they don't have to appear before this commission to get approval. That is equal to 16.8 acre feet. That would be the demand that would come out of it. And just for a ballpark, 15,000 gallons per day, that's about the size of an Olive Garden type facility. That's what their demand is on the system. As I mentioned, our current balance of 5641 remaining, and just to back to, I told you we acquired all these rights. This is just a checkpoint. So in 1996, this same report that we gave, we showed a balance of 1845 acre feet. So the utility has done an excellent job over the last 20 years to make sure that we're sustainable going into the future in terms of water rights. That's what I have for water, so open it up to questions.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Schultz? I have a question. On that last slide, you showed 15,000 gallons equals 16.8 acre feet. But is that the total of all commercial uses using 16.8 commercial acre feet, or is?
No, what that means, Darren Schultz for the record, what that means is that if a commercial user comes in and their demand is 15,000 gallons per day, that we would have to reduce our total allotment of acre feet that we have in the bank by 16.8.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. Mr. Sattler.
Didn't we, last year, or year before, wasn't it like half of that? Didn't we increase that fairly recently?
It was 2 years ago. It was at 7,500, and just with development coming in and our comfort level, we had kept it there many years, and we felt comfortable going to 15. But I don't see a reason to, at this point, go above 15 and or lower it.
Thank you.
One other question that I had when I was reading through your report was, I'm going to try to figure out what it was that I was going to ask, but do you find that the cost of water is a limiting factor in the use of water? I mean, are commercial users restricting their use based upon the cost of the water, or are they? Do you think that that's an issue?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's because we've had rate increases for our water, but we've also had some pretty squirrely weather, and to do both of those at the same time, it's really hard to narrow in on what is impacting people in terms of water usage, commercial and or residential. So we know from history and communities around us that there's definitely effect of, as you raise your rates, the consumer is going to back off on usage. How much that is, where that sweet spot is, I guess, it's really hard to narrow in on that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I think that's, oops, one more. No, I guess that's it.
Okay.
So Lee, do
Okay,
you-
I just want to quickly wrap up my presentation, and before I'd like to turn it over to the school district next. Based on the information that we've provided and received on growth management, our recommendation, I'd call it basically a status quo recommendation. The number of allocations each year have been roughly based on a growth rate of 3% for the last, since its origin. You could see it's kind of gone up over the years through various methods, but we're recommending that it be a 658 for next year. And the last thing I wanted to point out was that, I think certainly departments, the school district, everybody, growth is not going to come without challenges, and especially if we have increased growth rate that we might be seeing in the next year or two. But with that, even with that, at this point, we have no specific recommendations from any departments or outside agencies to actually further limit the number of permits are available. So that's the basis for the recommendation. And I think with that, I'll conclude and not go on anymore, and be available for questions, or if you're done with that, I'd like to have the school district go over their presentation.
Yeah, I think we'll just continue the presentations, and then we'll try to
Is it queued up?
combine all the questions.
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, city staff, thank you. My name is Richard Stokes. I'm superintendent of schools for Carson City. Appreciate the invitation to be here. I'd like to introduce to my left Mr. Andrew Fueling, who is our Director of Fiscal Services at the school district, and he'll be making the majority of our presentation this evening. And also Mr. Mark Cornick, who is beside me on my right, who is our Director of Operations. I'd like to thank personally Commissioner Borders for his work and support on our master plan committee. Also Mr. Plemmel, Ms. Sullivan. Staff has really been very helpful, and we just appreciate the partnership and the opportunity to be here tonight. So with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Mr. Fueling for our presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Stokes. Good evening, commissioners. I'll ask, as I go through this, if Mr. Cornick would like to interject at all, or Mr. Stokes, that they do so. I may be focused on this and not notice if they want to say something. So I don't know if this presentation is going to fit exactly what you want, but I think it'll give you a good perspective of where we see things going and some concerns that we have in getting there here in the near future. So this just trying to estimate population. Really, all of our concern centers around the number of school-age children coming into the area. And if you look at, actually, oh, it's not working. Here, I'll use the cursor. So you look at the historical population of Carson City over the decades, and look at that relative to the student population. And I don't have the student populations back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but getting into the 90s, 2000s, and 2010, you can see that the total student population, and look at that as a percentage of the total city population. So I think that's a fair marker to try to estimate what our student population is going to look like in the near future. I'll note that I have the population estimates escalating even more quickly than what Mr. Plummel showed you, but I do that only to kind of keep things concise and legible in a nice font size for you. So I'm not expecting that you're going to be at 75,000 here by 2040, but I think it'll help make the point. And so these numbers then, using this 13.4% of population as a low estimate and 15.4 as a high estimate, based on these Carson City populations, this is how many students we would expect to see somewhere to fall within that range over time. So by the time build-out happens, and again, I don't think any of us are expecting it by 2040, we would have over 10,000, maybe over 11,000 students in the Carson City School District. And now that's total student population. So if you're looking at the different schooling levels, and this becomes really important for us, especially at the elementary level, try to judge of those total students, what percent will be elementary, what percent are middle school, what percent are high school. And so this just looks at the current breakdown in this school year that we're in. So about 46% of our students are in the elementary school, 22% in middle school, and 30% are in high school. So using those percentages, you can see, and again, this works on those ranges of from the total Carson City population. So in 2020, we would estimate having somewhere between 3,600 and 4,100 elementary age students. And unfortunately, that's a pretty wide range, but that's the best numbers that we have to work with at this point. And so when you're looking at, currently we have 3,682 for elementary age students. When you're getting up near 4,700, 5,400, which is what we'd expect at full build out, you're looking at least, at a minimum, 2 new elementary schools in the city, potentially a third if it really would be at that larger number. At the middle school level, we would either need to add a new middle school or probably double the size of Eagle Valley, which is about half the size of Carson Middle School right now. And at the high school level, currently at 2,400, and they're full. Both of our high schools are full. So if we're looking potentially at either a major expansion at some point or a brand new high school, which I know has come up previously, but may be a serious question in the future. Are there any questions so far on any of this? Okay. No? Okay. So looking at the what we call conversion factors of the types of units that are built and how many students we would expect to take out of each, out of 100 of those units. These are the numbers we're working with right now, and we're still working on refining these with our most up-to-date data from the last 2 years. So these will likely be adjusted here in the coming months, but it gives an idea of, if you have 100 single-family homes built, we would expect 38 students to come out of those 100 homes. 100 apartment units, 20 would come out of that. If there's a mix of things, the average is a little over 30 per unit. So, and from that, we'll generate some of these kind of future numbers we're talking about. This map, and this map is over 6 months old, but I haven't asked for an updated one, but this is all the anticipated buildings. So the one Mr. Plum will show before is obviously ones that are approved, right? Correct. So the anticipated one. And so we were using this to try to estimate not only the number of students, but where those students would show up. And it's interesting because there's one area in particular is hit hit hard, but has the greatest increase in students, and then a couple others you'll notice really don't see all that much impact. So with all of that anticipated construction, we would expect that to generate about 11, almost 1,200 new students for us, and based on those percentages that I previously went through, it's about 555 elementary, 268 at the middle school level, and 363 at the high school level. And to note, 555 is that's about the average size of an elementary in Carson City right now. On the high side, I believe Sealiger and Boardwick Bray are both around 620, 630, and then on the low side, Fremont is right around 500. This was the best I could do, and I apologize for not having something that looks a little nicer, but to show you the current school zones, and when Fremont Elementary School used to be a year-round school, and when it stopped being a year-round school, the zone that was made to kind of fit is kind of a unique zone. So this is something that likely, regardless of what happens in the future, would be up for consideration in helping us manage the capacity issues we do have at our schools. So with all that anticipated construction, this is where those students we would expect would all fall, and you notice that Fremont by far has the largest, and that's entirely because of the Lampa development right next to it. Some of those kids, I believe, would also be zoned to Empire, but it's just a sliver of them. Sealiger reflects Schultz Ranch subdivision. Fritch reflects the ongoing Silver Oak development. Boardwick, I think, being slightly higher, is the Vintage development. So, and one of the concerns we have, and I don't know that as the school district we have any kind of idea of how realistic it is, but there's concern about a lot of development happening in concentrated areas, and the example I would offer is Fremont, in that as much as the city has a limit overall on the number of permits issued, if they're all issued around Fremont, it's almost like there is no limit at all for that particular zone. I mean, they would feel the full impact unless we would go through some rezoning. So that's just a concern that we have. We wrapped up what we call our facilities master planning committee in the last year, looking at our facility plans going forward for the next 5 to 10 years. And the major goals, the by far the biggest concern is capacity. So we're looking at ways to try to increase capacity across the district, replacing portable classrooms that are horribly inefficient and just not a great place to make education happen. Looking at instructional needs as those change and other major maintenance and improvement projects. And did talk a little bit about rezoning in the future and how that would likely need to be something we consider. So currently in the school district, we have one traditional classroom that is empty, and that is at Fremont Elementary School. In talking with every other principal, if you're looking at kind of the standard classroom you'd expect to walk into where you could fit 20 to 30 kids and a teacher, no other school has one room left. So that kind of frames the big concern we have, and it as much as we have this at the high school level, we have it at the middle school level. This is all schools. But at the elementary level, even though we do have the one classroom available, it is posing the greatest concern, and we think that's where the greatest growth might happen in the near future. And so the schools have already had to take steps to try to make things work for the students and for their staff, moving staff around and hopefully not breaking code, but putting people in alternative places to try to allow them to still do their jobs while having kids in a good space to continue on with their instruction. So in the near future, we definitely will be looking at a new elementary school. It's likely that, and this is a really hard number to kind of come to, but if we would bring in 250 new elementary school students, and they would somewhere in the district, preferably maybe near each other, if you're looking to build a school, which that would be generated by approximately 1,300 new housing units. So based on kind of those percentages I was showing you before, if you have, and the conversion factors, if you have this many units, it would give you this many kids, and then of this many kids, this percent would be elementary age students. And I just note in bold here, pre-K, pre-kindergarten through 5th grade. And one of the things that's coming down from the state is a strong emphasis to make not only offer pre-kindergarten, but offer it full day, which is a big change. And that may not seem like a big deal, but we have felt this directly because of what has happened with full day kindergarten. Previously, when kindergarten was only half day, you could offer 4 classes within 2 classrooms. And now we need 4 classrooms for 4 classes. Here, pre-K, what we currently offer is a half day program. And the same thing, if that becomes a full day program, it puts even more pressure on the schools to try to absorb them. So thinking if you had about 250 new students and then going through a rezoning process to try to maneuver another 200 to a new school, give you about 450 students. And we think at that point, you could likely justify building a new school on a really just a very quick surface look. It takes about 342 new students to cover your operating costs within one of our average elementary schools. So we wouldn't, with only 250 new students, that's not going to get you to the 342, but we probably won't have the opportunity to wait that long. We'll probably have to make a move before then. But that would, by rezoning, would allow us to reduce populations at the elementary school, the other elementary schools, which would be helpful. And then again, we'd have to consider at some point in the near future a new or expanded middle school, depending on what we see the populations there looking like. Currently, the funding we're working with, so the Facilities Master Plan Committee helped us guide the use of about $16.9 million in bond revenues. And again, the focus of that overwhelmingly was trying to find ways to increase capacity across the district and get rid of really aging portable facilities that we have students in. In fiscal year 21, so the 2021 school year, we're expecting to have another $20 million available. Now, when we started this process, the best numbers we had were that $20 million would be enough to build an elementary school. And if we did that, the completion would be in the year 2022 or 2022-23 school year, so about 5 years away from now. Washoe, with a lot of they passed their extra sales tax that they're going to be using to fund all sorts of new construction of schools, and they have now upped their average cost of an elementary to $23 million, and that is not including land. So there's been this escalation of construction costs very quickly that really concerns us. Expectations of interest rates increasing in the future, and just if this is happening really fast, speed of construction and phasing, it only puts more demand pressure on those construction costs. So we have concerns there about the ability to afford to build a new elementary school. The next round of availability for the school district is not until 26, which would put a new school built by 2028, 2029, which is likely too late for some of the immediate concerns we're looking at. So, and just to note that for what we have asked in the future is that if there are any developments that would significantly increase student enrollment, that it be required that as a condition of development, there be a donation of land to the school district to help us offset those costs. Unfortunately, we, as much as we get paid per pupil when a new student comes into the district, it doesn't translate in the same way as far as funding bonding capacity. So it just is a kind of a tough spot for us from a capital standpoint. So I think one of the questions was, is there a recommendation for a number of permits? And I don't think we're in a place to give any type of intelligent answer along those lines. But I think just we appreciate the communication and the relationship we have with the city, and just considering us when these sorts of things come up.
Okay, thank you for that. Very informative. Does anybody have any questions for the school district representatives? Mr. Sattler.
You showed an area, the 136 with the Vintage project. I know that originally was a senior project and that was lifted, but I think that still will largely probably be a senior project. Are you still considering that to largely be that way?
I honestly, I'd have to look back. I'm not sure. I remember that change happening when I was originally generated these numbers. I'm not sure if that was before or after that change happened, so it may even be more significant than what that shows.
And you mentioned also that Eagle Valley, an option with the Lampa, et cetera, that would be a big area, and I know they're considering some land and whatever over by that area for another school. Is it less expensive to double the size of Eagle Valley, and is there the space there than it would be to try to build another one, or?
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner, for that question. And if I might just add, large numbers of middle school kids are hard to police. And we've made some philosophical decisions. And so that there's a variety of ways that we might go about trying to tackle that condition. And that, could be build more of a classroom type building for middle schoolers, and actually use that maybe for like a STEM building. And again, this is just some ideas, but then that allows us to build a facility that doesn't have all the playing fields, all of the gymnasiums, but it has maybe more of the arts type program. And then we could actually fill that building from both sites, reducing the numbers at Carson Middle, and allowing us to use maybe a trimester type look. So again, just thinking out loud, but ways that we could do it, because you saw the limitations that we have in terms of finances to try to build a building that is typical for housing middle school age kids. So there's a variety of ways that we can maybe go about doing some of these things, but working within the limitations, obviously, of what we have available to us for funding.
If I could just add too, so the Washoe County School District that is going through this process with all their new funds, I believe they're estimating if there is a new construction middle school, and that's not including land, it's at $50 to $60 million, and a new construction high school is about $100 million.
So I'm assuming that all of your projections and anticipated costs are based upon an assumption that there aren't going to be any new revenue streams for the schools, that everything's going to be, as you retire indebtedness, you can then bond more?
That'd be correct. There was a bill that recently died that would have allowed the school districts across the, school districts of our size and smaller to levy for an impact fee when new development happens, but that just recently died. So what Washoe did was a really unique outcome of the last legislative session, and the ability to try to increase the sales tax to generate more bonding capacity that has sunset already. So as of right now, the only stream that seems reasonable is the debt service, and just kind of continue the rolling that as they fall off and rebonding again.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Sadler.
You had mentioned about requesting that they would donate the land with larger developments if a school was needed. Is that something that is in our capacity to put in there, or would that have to be done by the supervisors or legislature, or who?
Yeah, well, without going, yeah, I think that's something that could be considered on a project by project basis. Again, I think as looking at the required findings and the impacts, I mean, that would be one possible way to do it. The absolute what the school district can ask for, short of your discretionary approval and maybe ability to do that, what they can do per NRS is only ask for the developer to put aside land, which way they would have to purchase and have the ability then to build a school on. But yeah, I think on a case-by-case basis, that's something that the city can do if it's something that needs to happen under the mitigations to make the findings for approval of a project.
Thank you.
That when he was doing his presentation, I mean, that would seem to disadvantage the smaller developer. It only puts the burden on a larger developer, and a multitude of smaller developers can have the same impact as one larger developer. And it just seems like we need to have some other mechanism for dealing with school funding or getting facilities built.
Well, and there was a case where I think there was $1,000 per and so much per residential was part of that development. That could be carried across different size developments as well.
Okay, well, we can't talk about school funding, but but it is an important issue, and we definitely appreciate your quandary. If there aren't any more questions for the school district, I think we'll bring it back to the Community Development Department to proceed with their discussion. You have no more discussions?
Nope, we're ready for additional questions or additional public comment.
Okay. Well, as I was going through your staff report, I had a number of questions, and I think either Darren or Mr. Pittenger is probably going to be the on the Public Works staff report. They talked about existing resources. Well, in various meetings that I've attended, we know that existing revenues are not sufficient to adequately deal with maintenance of the existing system. And I guess my question is, how can we be increasing the the overall system and not coming up with mechanisms for maintaining those as well as the ones that currently exist.
So while Darren's thinking of a good answer for that,
Are you referring to transportation?
Yes, I am.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, I'm
Well,
referring to roads.
yeah,
and
so
streets.
generally, and I do, so I'm going to make it just a general statement first. That some of these, and that's just looking, let's say we're looking at residential development, a subdivision, does it pay for itself? That's a fiscal analysis of that specific thing, and you can count the revenues from it that go to the fund that pays for those things, and it doesn't cover the cost of maintaining those roads long-term. That is not an economic impact analysis, though, that you would need to do citywide to really see, are those residents filling jobs? Because basically in these fiscal analysis, when you do them citywide, kind of the commercial makes up for where the residential is often in terms of their impacts per dollar generated to the city are much less on those facilities, so it's offset. So there's a caution of just saying that the answer is to stop all residential construction. That's a narrow analysis of the impacts of those directly related to those things and not a general economic impact analysis. And I just learned that at the planning conference and learning the difference and asked the question of the experts, and they're like, oh yeah, the answer is always, well, it depends. Yeah.
Well, and if I may, Mr. Chairman, I'll expand on it depends. Following that theme, the
Would you identify yourself?
oh, I'm
Mr.
sorry,
Pittenger?
Patrick Pittenger, Transportation Manager, Public Works. You know, the answer of it depends is it does directly apply to transportation. Obviously, there are numerous different types of taxes and fees that are paid by development. When we look at transportation and roads specifically, indeed, you can do different economic analyses that Mr. Plemmel referred to as far as under the current tax structure, what are the expected revenues based on different types of development with different types of roads. And therefore, the amount that is covered going on in the future does depend on how big are the roads, how many roads are there compared to different types of development. You could have a denser development and smaller roads and maybe have a better cost recovery factor. But you know, in summary, we do know that under our current system, it is true that we know that the development doesn't pay for itself, and in other places that have different taxing structures, they may have a different math they can calculate. But at the moment, it is what it is, and there may be efforts. There have been recent efforts. There was an attempt recently to change legislation to help try to change that a little bit, and it may or may not go forward. But it is something that can change over time.
Thank you for that.
I'll just add on to that,
Okay.
Darren Schultz for the record. We are, there's multiple funding streams, as was mentioned, but we are considering at staff level various proposals and things to bring forward, and we're discussing impact fees and what that could be used for and how that would help the burden. So that is something that we're talking about, we're researching, and over the next year you'll hear the term, I'm sure.
Okay, and if I could suggest a transportation heresy, that you look at potentially revising the development standards for roads to reduce the size of the road, not necessarily the quality of the road, but the size of the road, so that your long-term maintenance obligations go down as opposed to what the current standards would require. So, any other questions for staff? Ms. Green.
I have a question about, and maybe this was for fire and police. These all seem like, the report we have here seems like they're asking for these things, for these FTEs and these supplies. Are they gonna get them? I'm a little confused by that. Can you please clarify?
Right, so obviously you don't have the authority to grant funding for positions, and you're making a recommendation on growth management to the Board of Supervisors. So as with these things, it's information for the board to consider and not only what the impacts of growth are and should they limit the number of building permits for the following year, but looking at the long-term impacts and thinking about funding for that growth for city facilities and staffing.
That leads into my second question then. This seems to be, we had all this information last year. This seems to be a little more intense on the parts of these entities, saying they need more. We are growing. So my question is then, why are we issuing 18 more than we did last year?
Well, it's based on the formula that I've just been using, which is not a required formula, I must say. It's just a method to get to a number that roughly estimates a number for 3% growth, and I just used the formula for consistency. It's only a little bit more because we had some increase in population recently versus prior year. So it's based. The basis for the number is our most recent demographer population.
Okay, Mr. Borders.
The difficulty I think we have is wrestling with that number. You could make it 2.98 and it would be the same number. Or you could make it 2.6 and it would be less. But the question is, what do we gain from that? And I think the one thing about being consistent is that you have a scale then to look at every year instead of trying to follow the bouncing ball. And, you know, I had the same question earlier, and it just occurs to me that as long as we're not pushing the stops anywhere, if we leave it the same, then we at least have something year after year after year to compare against and not have to go back and figure out, oh, 2 years ago it was 2.8, now it's 2.4, and now it's 2.75. Just to make a number look good. It just doesn't seem to make any sense to do that.
Okay, so if there are no more questions for staff, is anybody in the public like to address this issue? Now's your opportunity. Okay. Well, I will close the public comment portion of the public hearing and bring it back to the commission for further discussion and action.
I'll make a motion.
Go ahead.
I'll make a motion. I move to recommend the Board of Supervisors approval of a maximum of 658 residential building permits entitlements for 2018 with an allocation of 283 entitlements for the general property owner category and 375 entitlements for the development category, and to continue the commercial and industrial development annual average water usage threshold of 15,000 gallons per day for Growth Management Commission review, and distribution and allocation for future years as further provided in the draft Board of Supervisors resolution.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second by Mr. Borders. Any further discussion on the item? All right. Seeing none, I will call for the vote. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? We have one absent and one vacancy. Motion passes. Thank you very much. Thank you for that informative presentation. What's your,
I don't need to.
does anybody need to break? Okay. Well, we will proceed to the next item on the agenda. We will reconvene as the Planning Commission. Actually, we should adjourn as the Growth Management. Oh, public comment. One further opportunity for public comment on growth management. Seeing none, we will adjourn as the Growth Management Commission and reconvene as the Planning Commission and move into public hearing matters. Item H1 is TSM-17-052 for possible action to make a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors regarding a tentative subdivision map request from G&E Investments, property owners Gordon Street LLC and G&E Investments LLC, to approve a tentative subdivision map for 16 single-family attached residential units in a common open space development on property zoned multifamily apartment within the Brown Street specific plan area located at 1709, 1725, 1759, and 1809 North Edmonds Drive, APNs 008-306-09, 11, 15, and 16. Ms. Pansky.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the record, Susan Pansky, Special Projects Planner. So this project is called the North Edmonds Common Open Space Development. It's proposed within the Brown Street specific plan area. Basically what that is it's an overlay district that was created as a part of the Carson Master Plan in 2006, and that specific plan area has additional requirements beyond those of the standard master plan and the underlying zoning district of multifamily apartment. This entire area was rezoned multifamily apartment in the absence of a mixed-use mixed-use zoning district that hasn't been created yet. So multifamily apartment development standards typically apply. The applicant is proposing to create 16 new single-family attached lots within the common open space development over an existing 4 lots within the Brown Street area now. And that this is located between Fairview Drive and North Edmonds Drive. I apologize for not mentioning that on the aerial. So there are 4 existing lots with 4 existing houses within the Brown Street area now. The developer is proposing to demolish those 4 homes and create 16 single-family attached homes in their place. And I'll note one of the goals of the Brown Street specific plan area is targeted infill development. So higher density, infill, more efficient product within this area is highly encouraged and is what is being proposed by the applicant. I mentioned that the underlying zoning district is multifamily apartment. So the reason why the applicant chose to do a common open space development is because within our code, this particular provision allows for the variation of lot sizes within a development to better utilize the land. Multifamily apartment has a minimum lot size of 6,000 square feet, and generally that's intended for a multifamily project, not a single family project. But the common open space development allows for variation from that to have different size of lots. And I'll note that within this overall development size of approximately 1.4 acres, the lot sizes range anywhere from 2,800 square feet to 4,600 square feet, with the average being 3,700 square feet. So significantly lower than the multifamily minimum lot requirement. So this allows them to proceed without doing a variance. So the one thing that I'd like to note before I move on to elevations and specific requirements in the Brown Street plan is each one of these lots is individual to the home and also the space around it, which although the common open space development is a little bit misleading because you can have common open space within it or you can have private open space. It doesn't have to be both. It can be one or the other. So the applicant's actually proposing all private open space. And on an example, lot number 1 here, so it would just function like a regular lot. They have a rear yard, they have a side yard where that's applicable, and then they have a front yard. And in the case of these, the front yard lot would go all the way to the center of the shared driveway. And there would be easements placed across that driveway for access of all the other units. These are the elevations that are being proposed by the applicant. As I mentioned, all single-family attached units. 3 bedrooms, 2 car garages, 2 bath, I believe, in all of them. One of the unique things about this is that all of the garages don't face the main roads. They face their internal driveways, which actually meets one of the requirements of the Brown Street specific plan area. And as I mentioned, all the Brown Street area has specific development standards that are, it applies to it beyond what the zoning code allows or requires. And generally, the applicant meets all of those requirements. But one thing I'll note, and we've recommended a specific condition of approval, is that they've oriented the building so that in the case where the homes front Fairview and Edmonds Drive, the front door faces those streets, which is appropriate given the requirements in the Brown Street specific plan. However, in reviewing these elevations, staff felt that while adding basically a pseudo porch area, and I'm talking about basically this side elevation here, while adding that certainly lends itself to making it look like a front elevation, the window placement and the lack of additional architectural detail does not lend itself to a front elevation, and so we've recommended a condition that would allow for a beefing up of that architectural design to make it more aesthetically pleasing to the streetscape. They are required under multifamily apartment standards to comply with the landscape standards under Division 3 of our development standards. This is a proposed plan that was submitted with the application, shows a variety of trees, and at the time of the final map and the improvement plans, we will check for compliance with actual landscape plans for this project. One thing I'll note is related to what I mentioned previously, the private open space versus a common open space. So because this is in a multifamily apartment zoning district, there are other development standards that apply, just strictly based on the zoning. And one of those in our current code is that a common open space element is required beyond just a private open space element. That doesn't really make sense for single-family projects within the multifamily district because a single-family home isn't typically going to have common open space. And so you'll remember last week at your Special Planning Commission meeting, there was a zoning text amendment proposed to address that, and that specifically was triggered by the question that came up as a part of this project. So there is a condition in the recommended conditions of approval that states that basically this approval is not effective until that zoning text amendment is approved by the Board of Supervisors, and we anticipate that that will happen next month. Other than that, they comply with the multifamily apartment standards where they're applicable, and they meet the findings for both a tentative map. There aren't specific findings for a common open space development. Staff is recommending approval with the conditions that were set forth in the staff report. And applicant's representative is here to answer questions, and I'm happy to answer questions as well.
Okay, are there any questions for Ms. Pansky? Mr. Borders?
I noticed in the report that there wasn't very much from the fire department. Are they concerned at all about that street not having a cul-de-sac on it? It's pretty short, and it's a driveway, but it is their only access.
Do you want to address this? Beyond their comments that they provided in
Okay.
They didn't specifically call that out as a concern.
Well, I suspect that's one reason why it's a private street, so they don't have to put a cul-de-sac on it.
No, it wouldn't be related to being a private street. It would be related to the length of the street and how far
Okay.
it would be. That's usually what, there's a certain distance before it requires a turnaround. If they can reach the hose across the lot,
Okay,
they're usually not
all
requiring
right.
turnaround.
Well, then it's probably okay.
I had a few notes. I just trying to find them here. Since this is a multifamily apartment zoning district, what would be the maximum number of units that could be placed upon the three lots, three current lots? They're proposing 16 units, but I
Right.
know that under a multifamily apartment, they could have
Yeah.
way more than that. I'm just curious as to how many that would be.
So Lee's doing the calculation for me right now. But provided that they meet the multifamily standards, which is one, I think the density required under that, or the maximum density allowed, and let me just get back to that section, is in the case of 2 bedrooms or more, 1 unit per 1,500 square feet of area. So however that calculation works out, it's significantly higher, I think, than what's being proposed
Yeah.
by the applicant.
That would be my guess.
How big's the site?
1.4 acres approximately.
And I would agree with you that the variation, because of the way these homes are focused inward, that the streetscape standards for the specific plan area are definitely can be varied to accommodate that.
And just to follow up on your question, 38 units an acre is what would be allowed under
Yeah.
this, or 38 units total would be allowed with the density calculation for
Okay.
this area.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Sattler.
I didn't fully understand, it's where the end units, where they're facing the street, they're supposed to have their doors facing the street. Are they changing that, or are you just changing the style on that end?
Sure. So the middle elevation here, you can see that basically this area here is what's going to face Edmonds and Fairview. And more particularly of concern is Edmonds, because that's more of a local street within the Brown Street area versus Fairview, which is a major arterial. So what they've done to make this look more like a front elevation is add this porch area here over this front door that's here. But what staff is proposing is to basically beef that up, you know, make it look a little bit more like a front elevation, possibly add some articulation through, you know, the placement of shutters or, you know, some other kind of architectural detail. And we certainly didn't want to tie them to specific elements at this point, but directed them through the condition of approval to work with staff. Yeah.
And this may be more, I'll ask the applicant, but is there going to be any access to the site from Fairview, or is it going to be a solid sound wall fence type of thing?
So engineering actually did have a condition of approval that access to Fairview Drive be provided, pedestrian access, not vehicular access.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, would the applicant like to step forward and state their name and give us their view of the project? Have you received the staff report and are okay with the conditions of approval?
I have, and I am.
Okay, thank you.
For the record, Chris Baker, Manhart Consulting. Mr. Chair, members of the commission, I haven't seen you for a little while. Hope you're well. Again, I'd like to thank Susan for doing quite a great job of giving an overview of our project. She makes our job quite easy, to be honest with you. Again, she touched on a few things that are kind of the outline of the Brown Street specific plan, excuse me. Kind of the redevelopment of infill projects. I mean, I think we all can agree these 4 parcels now are not really maximized from a development potential. They obviously currently don't meet some of the Brown Street standards. And really what we're proposing is coming up with a product type and a development plan that not only complements the existing community that's there now, I think that's very important, but just as important is kind of encompassing the vision of that specific plan as we move forward with kind of redeveloping this whole area. So I feel like we've done a pretty good job of trying to touch on all those bases. A couple just kind of point outs. From the common open space development, I know that is a little bit misleading. You hear common open space. In this case, it's not actually common. Obviously, the reason why it wouldn't be common, common open space requires some sort of HOA to carry that. With 16 units, you're not going to fund an HOA, so therefore a project like this could not function. So what we've done is chosen the private route. With the private route, you know, you end up getting single-family attached. You get private yards. What the developer has done is proposed to install both front and rear yard landscaping. Obviously, they will not maintain that going forward because there's no mechanism for that. But I think it's important when someone comes in and buys this product, they're actually getting a finished product. Getting back on the open space, we're looking at 42% of the site being in a private open space. So when you look at that, you get the 1.37 acres, but the building pads are relatively small because they are 2 stories. So we're going to have a pretty lush landscaped area. Touching on the Commissioner Borders' fire question, the standard is 150 feet. Those stub streets are actually on 136 feet, so we're below the requirement for a turnaround. And then, the max for that 150-foot shared driveway is 8 units, so we cap out right at that. So with that, I think I'll defer the rest of my time to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions for the applicant?
I have one.
Mr. Borders?
To get back to my favorite subject today, the street.
Yes.
If there is no HOA, how is that street maintained?
We have a condition of approval for a maintenance agreement between the property owners. That's not going to be just limited to the street itself. That's obviously, anytime you have attached product, if someone wants to reshingle the roof or paint something, they have to actually have to cross someone's property to do so. So there will be, and there is a condition for a maintenance agreement between all the property owners to be in place.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Are there any other questions? Okay. Is there anyone from the public who would like to address this item? Seeing none, we'll bring it back for further discussion and consideration. Mr. Salerno.
I'm sorry. It's a big improvement from what is there currently, and I think it fits in very nice. I think the architecture is interesting, and it'll be a nice addition to the community. I'd like to make a motion for move of approval. I move to recommend approval of TSM-17-052, a tentative subdivision map consisting of 16 single-family attached residential units in a common open space development on property zone multifamily apartment within the Brown Street specific plan area located at 1709, 1725, 1759, and 1809 North Edmonds Drive. APNs 008-306-09, 11, 15, and 16, based on the findings and subject to the recommended conditions of approval in the staff report.
Okay. We have a motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
We have a second by Mr. Sattler. Is there any further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call for the vote. All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? We have a unanimous affirmative vote with one absent. Thank you. We're moving on.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Mr. Borders.
before we consider the next item, I noticed that we have a couple of visitors in the back. I assume they're here for citizen of the community. We have 2 Boy Scouts. They're working on a merit badge that's a requirement for their Eagle requirement. And I would just like to thank them for being there and putting up with us. Good job, guys.
Thank you for that recognition. All right, moving on to item H2, TUP-17-053 for possible action. To make a recommendation to the Board of Supervisors regarding a tentative plan unit development request from Liberty Homes LLC, property owner Vernon C. Lee Family Trust, to approve an amendment to the existing Riverview Terrace plan unit development to divide 2 parcels into 5 on property zone single-family 21,000 plan unit development located at 4044 and 4080 Hells Bells Road, APNs 010-361-05 and 010-361-06. Ms. Pansky.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a request for an amendment to an existing PUD, the Riverview Terrace PUD, on a little over 3 acres just off of Hells Bells Road. And I have an aerial that's a little bit further away initially to show the overall Riverview Terrace PUD that's located here. And then a closer aerial indicating where the parcels are located in relation to the lots along Hells Bells Road. And this is just before the intersection with Park Hill Drive. So there are 2 existing lots, and they're outlined in yellow on this aerial. The applicant is proposing to take these 2 existing lots and divide them into 5 lots. And because of an increase in the overall units of the PUD, staff determined that a PUD amendment would be appropriate. I'll note that this PUD was approved by the board in 1978, prior to the majority of our current zoning codes. So doing an analysis based on the current PUD ordinance, while in most cases appropriate, doesn't necessarily apply in all cases. Regardless, the lots that are being proposed by the applicant are consistent with the underlying zoning district of single-family 21,000 square feet. They're proposing 5. This is the tentative map page with the grading proposed. The site is located within the hillside development area, which basically, per our development standards, means that if the site average is over 15% slope, then hillside development requirements are triggered. I'll note that the dashed line that runs across here, which is basically the developable area or the area being proposed for development by the applicant, comes out to an 11% slope. And while hillside development standards will still apply, a special use permit is not required. Whereas if it were over 15%, then a special use permit would be incorporated into this request. However, it is not. So as I mentioned, 5 lots, all consistent with the underlying zoning district of single-family 21,000. And this is within the existing PUD area of Riverview Terrace. So one thing that I wanted to note is that when you're looking at one of the more important aspects of a PUD, which is open space percentage versus residential lot area percentage, it's based on area, not on number of units or density. So there is no increase in the area of the PUD in this case, and so an increase in the open space wouldn't be required. The current open space, I believe, in this development is over 40%. Our current requirements are 30%. I believe at the time that this was approved in 1978, NRS had a 40% requirement, so they met that standard at the time, and they continue to meet the standard as well today. These are the elevations being proposed by the applicant, and there may be some variation as the final map records in which elevation goes on which lot, but generally these are the 3 elevations that are being proposed. Semi-custom homes that will be for sale. And I think that they range in size anywhere from just over 1,700 square feet to just under 2,000 square feet. One of the things that staff noted in the review of this application is that there is a standard in the single-family 21,000 square foot requirements for a maximum lot depth, which is 240 feet. Several of these lots exceed that requirement. However, the 2 lots that were there previously also exceeded that requirement. So it's a slight expansion of that non-conforming use, but we feel that it's appropriate in this case and have incorporated a variance into this PUD amendment request, not only for the fact that those lots originally existed with that nonconformance, but also because of the significant slope on these lots that really makes the back half of them undevelopable. Staff is recommending approval with the conditions that are outlined in your report. They are able to meet the planned unit development findings as well as the subdivision findings with this proposed amendment. The applicant's representative is in the audience for questions, and I'm available for questions as well.
Thank you. Are there any questions for the staff at this point? Seeing none, if the applicant would like to, Mr. Baker.
Second one's free, right? Again, Chris Baker with Manhart Consulting here on behalf of the applicant. This one's very interesting. I think Lee can attest to this, and Hope, and definitely Susan. When you and I think of a PUD, this isn't it. This was essentially a development agreement from 1977 that was really, it was commonly known as the Terry Agreement, that was transferring the city and the property owner in return for water rights, availability of hookups for water and sewer. There's no development standards, there's no maximum density. There is a minimum residential hookups of 262. Those were mapped, and that's the PUD. So when we're talking about comparing, against a traditional, is there an increase in density? Is there an increase in open space? Although the overall acreage and the open space, yes, because those are going to be constants. The density, again, it's very negligible because we're looking at adding 3 lots to 262, so you're looking at about a 1% increase. That base density really is not there, to be honest with you. It gets a little more confusing in that not only were there not any development standards originally when this was entitled, the property was zoned ag, and then that was in 77, and in 79, the property for some reason was zoned SFR 12, so 12,000 square foot lots. And we're just assuming that was based off of the size of the lots that were, mapped via the PUD. And then in 1986, it was zoned SFR 21, which is what it is now. So I bring all this up just because, typically to create 3 new parcels, we would just come in and do a parcel map, as long as we're meeting the underlying zoning, which in this case we are. But because of the complexities of this fulfilled water and sewer agreement and the mapping of the PUD, we're here for a PUD amendment. So yes, obviously there is a PUD amendment, and that's a very important portion of this. But from a development standpoint, the property is SFR 21. We're trying to do over 21,000 square foot lots. So I know hopefully I didn't confuse you further, but there's a lot there. So with that, I'll defer my time for any questions. Thank you.
Okay, and and the owner are in agreement with us, the conditions of approval?
We are, yes.
Okay. Are there any questions for the applicant? Okay. Did I have any? Not at this time. Is there anybody from the public who wishes to address this item?
Lucinda Long, a resident of Hells Bells. My concern is my experience with the one existing house on this area. It took them ages to get a backyard that would stabilize the hill, and even this year we're still seeing dirt running off the property onto the street. It's a very, there's not a whole lot of flat land around there. And I cannot tell from this how they are going to keep the public space hill very nice and the backyards very flat. And that is my concern. I'm not opposed to the project in any way. I think it's just, I'm concerned that, as you all know, backyards that are cut out of hillsides are a general disaster. So I bring that to your attention before you approve.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else wish to address this item? Okay. Mr. Baker, would you like to address that concern?
So as I understand it, and I think Stephen might be able to touch a little bit more on this, the existing home now is actually pushed a little bit. It does sit a little bit higher than these will, but it's pushed farther forward and actually makes up grade in the front yards, which requires retaining walls, so it has a relatively steep driveway, which kind of probably exacerbates some of those issues. These are going to be pushed back as far as we can, so we have a little bit flatter driveway. Yes, obviously there's going to be some necessary for some grading in the rear yards, but what that'll do is maximize that pad and try to keep it as flat as possible. I would like to point out, and I apologize for not doing so, once we did figure out this was in a PUD, the applicant volunteered, got the notification list from the city and did conduct a neighborhood meeting prior to this, and did receive great input. I believe he had anywhere from 12 to 15 people at a time. They were kind of going in and out. The immediate adjacent property owners were all there, and some good dialogue and some good conversation came about. So.
Okay, thank you for that. I notice on the site plan that there is a 8-foot retaining wall on the west, let's see, what is that? The southwest corner of the lot number 1. And then behind that and behind all of lots 1 through 4, there's a fairly significant cut that will be filled with riprap?
No, it probably won't be riprap, no.
Because it does indicate that on the.
I guess I should look at my plans a little closer, huh? If necessary, yes. What we'd prefer to do in some of those cases is some sort of hydroseed or revegetation. I think it benefits the homeowner, but from a maintenance standpoint, if you do get up into a 2-to-1, a lot of times riprap is necessary.
Okay, but that would, and this would be a question for staff, would that be an engineering decision whether to require riprap on the cut slope?
Stephen with Carson City Development Engineering for the record. Yeah, so the hillside development standard requires slope stabilization, and it does give specific slopes and gives some different methods that can be used, and they have some freedom as to which slope stabilization they choose, but that'll be part of the improvement permit review.
Okay, thank you for that. I bring that up just because it addresses the issue that was brought up by the public. Is there anyone else from the public who wishes to address this? Okay, then I will close the public comment portion of this and bring it back to the commission for consideration. Is there any discussion? I'd just like to say that I really think it'll be an improvement for the area. I've been down there a lot, and I've seen that it gets trashed quite a bit, but.
Yes, but it is undeveloped space.
Right. No, I understand your position, but I think that from a standpoint of making sure that it doesn't become more of a recreation area, that this will be an improvement.
It's not often you see in plans or whatever, there's a graffiti. One of the requirements of the homeowner will be to keep the graffiti off one of the walls. So.
Okay. Is there any further discussion? I'd entertain a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion. I move to recommend approval of TPUD 17-053, an amendment to the Riverview Terrace Planned Unit Development to divide 2 parcels into 5 on property zone single-family 21,000. Planned unit development on property located at 4044 and 4080 Hells Bells Road, APN 010-361-05 and 06, based on the findings and subject to the recommended conditions of approval in the staff report.
Okay, and I would just like to clarify that motion to make sure that we are also granting the variance for the maximum lot depth.
I think staff doesn't have a problem with that.
Okay.
Okay.
Would
So
you,
moved.
you would accept that?
I'll accept that.
Okay. We have a motion.
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second by Ms. Green. Is there any further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? None, unanimous with one absent. Thank you.
Could we take a 5-minute break, sir?
Yes, we're going to take a 5-minute break at this point.
This one might take a while.
Call this meeting back to order and continue on with item H3.
Wait for our lawyer and.
Yeah. SUP-17-048 for possible action. To consider a request for a special use permit from Ken Rose, property owner, Gold Lock Corp., to allow multifamily residential development on property zoned retail commercial plan unit development located at G.S. Richards Boulevard, APN 007-461-19. Ms. Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hope Sullivan, Planning Manager. The subject request is for a special use permit for a 150-unit apartment complex. The subject property is 6.2 acres and located southeast of the intersection of G.S. Richards Boulevard and Silver Oak Drive. The zoning's retail commercial, so you need special use, multifamily dwellings are a conditional use in the retail commercial zoning district. The master plan designation is mixed-use commercial. The property is surrounded by retail commercial zoning in either vacant land or non-residential land. Some of you may have been on the commission when there was an apartment complex considered across the street from this on G.S. Richards Boulevard. In reviewing this project, the staff used the same methodology that was applied on that project to create consistency in terms of the arguments regarding density, the percentage of the mixed-use commercial that could be allocated to residential, and so forth. The applicant is proposing the 150-unit apartment complex with units housed in 7 buildings. The applicant is also proposing a pool, a clubhouse, and a fitness center on the site. Building materials will be board and batten and corrugated metal siding with vertical standing seam roofs. Access will be from G.S. Richards Boulevard with an emergency gated access way on Silver Oak Drive. So that will only be for fire access and exit, not for the general public. Parking will be provided on site at 1.7 spaces per unit, which is consistent with what was recently approved at Carson Hills apartment complex down south by the Fandango, and is in excess of the Institute of Transportation Engineer standard of 1.2 spaces per unit. So you'll recall that the Community Development Director has the authority to allow a standard different than the standard identified in the municipal code when such a standard is a derivative of an acceptable standard. The applicant actually asked to use the ITE standard of 1.2, and it struck me as too low, and we went with the 1.7, which was approved at Carson Hills and what Carson Hills had been seeking. There's been some questions about the on-street parking, so I want to speak to that. What the code says is that you need to supply two spaces per unit, and if the adjacent roadway does not accommodate on-street parking, you must have guest parking on site. In this case, the adjacent roadway does accommodate on-street parking, which means there's not a requirement to have guest parking on site. And that's just an application of the regulation. The applicant, in preparing his application, identified that guest parking would be accommodated on the street. And I think that created confusion that they weren't supplying parking spaces that they were required to supply, but they're indeed not required to supply guest parking on site, given the width of that roadway. The site plan does comply with the required setbacks and open space requirements. We have had a lot of questions on traffic, and so I asked the Transportation Manager, Patrick Pittenger, to speak to you about the traffic analysis and the traffic from this site. Dirk Goring, who is also one of our transportation planners, is also present, and I'll just turn it over to Patrick to proactively address the traffic analysis. Actually, I'll just finish and then turn it over to Patrick. So again, as you know, when you consider a special use permit, there are 7 findings of fact. In this case, because we're in a non-residential zoning district, there are 2 additional findings of fact. Staff was able to find the 7 required findings of fact for the SUP and the 2 supplemental findings of fact in the affirmative, and we are recommending approval. I'll now turn it over to Patrick, and then I'm available for questions. Ken Rose, the architect, is here on behalf of the applicant's team and does have a presentation.
Okay. Mr. Pittenger.
Thank you, Patrick Pittenger, Transportation Manager. And I'll note that in addition from the applicant team is Mr. Paul Seleggi, professional engineer. He is the traffic engineer that actually prepared the report that I will reference, and he's here as well as needed. The summary from the city standpoint, from the Transportation Division, is that the applicant did provide a required traffic study that did meet the requirements of the city, specifically related to this development. I'll just mention that there were adjustments made by the applicant to the access points. Ms. Sullivan is correct about of course, about the fire exit to the north, and we do have proper spacing for the entries off of G.S. Richards Boulevard, so we're satisfied with those. Those were developed with input from development engineering as well. Mr. Pote, as far as the actual traffic generation, they provided the required report, and specifically, they did look at nearby intersections and the impact of this proposed development, the distribution of the trips, and they did so not only for the existing conditions but forecast conditions as well. And the important finding is that they did show that the forecast traffic volumes at the nearby intersections would not have conditions that exceed city standards. As a reminder, the threshold for the city is level of service D for an intersection, and they did show, and just also as a reminder, the level of service in an intersection is primarily related to the delay that's experienced by vehicles trying to negotiate the movement that they are making. So while the project is expected to generate additional traffic, it is not expected to have any specific movements that violate the city standards. It has been noted that, for example, at the intersection of Silver Oak and Carson Street, there is not a signal there today. Less than 10 years ago, the connection was made of Silver Oak between G.S. Richards Boulevard and Carson Street. The intersection was constructed to allow for the implementation of a future signal. The traffic report supplied does not indicate the necessity for the signal at this time. That doesn't mean that you aren't going to experience delay if you're trying to make, for example, a left turn from Silver Oak onto Carson Street, but that delay does not exceed the city standard that is provided in our city requirements. It is reasonable to consider that there will be potential future impacts at these intersections, but not related specifically to this development. And I will mention that the forecasts that they used for the year 2035 do assume land use growth in the area as well. And I'll leave that and take any questions.
Okay. Are there any questions for staff? Mr. Borders.
So the access to Silver Oak is going to be through the entrance down Richards to Silver Oak, correctly?
Yes, that is correct.
And the other is just an emergency entrance?
Yes, that is correct. That's a relatively short distance between G.S. Richards and Carson Street.
Right.
So we did not feel comfortable with having a full access there.
Okay.
But emergency access was fine.
Okay, and I noted in the staff report that there was mention of the G.S. Richards serving as a primary bikeway. Is the on-street parking going to interfere with that?
Stephen Pote for the record, Carson City Development Engineering. So yeah, currently, per the Unified Pathways Master Plan, there's a shared detached pathway on the west side of the street. I believe that's what you're referring to.
Okay,
And that's an
I thought I
existing.
read in.
Right, it's condition 22, and what it says is that G.S. Richards Boulevard has an existing multi-use path along the west side of the road, and this path provides the connectivity to the John Mankins Park located in the Silver Oak development, and the applicant will provide pedestrian facilities from the development to the multi-use path north of the traffic circle and maintain the pedestrian crossing at the intersection of Silver Oak and G.S. Richards Boulevard. So the acknowledgement was the multi-use path on the west side and looking for pedestrian connectivity out of the apartment
Okay,
complex.
and I was also misreading item 21, condition 21, which refers to Silver Oak, the bike path on Silver Oak, and which the parking, the on-street parking isn't proposed for Silver Oak, is that correct?
Yeah,
When we reviewed the project, it said the street adjacent, what the regulation says is that if the street adjacent to the project does not accommodate on-street parking, you must accommodate guest parking on site. We specifically looked at G.S. Richards Boulevard, as that was the longer stretch of road, identified that that accommodated on-street parking. I don't know that we analyzed Silver Oak Drive because the logical place to park felt like G.S. Richards Boulevard.
Just curious.
and if I may, the lane configuration on GS Richards, or excuse me, on Silver Oak really would not allow for any on-street parking on Silver Oak there.
Okay.
Yeah, they're exactly, there are turn lanes there and bike lanes that there won't be any parking on Silver Oak.
Okay, and since the traffic analysis doesn't indicate or doesn't warrant any new signalization at Silver Oak and Carson Street at this time, when and if the warrants are met, is there any requirement that this developer participate in the cost of that? Is there some formula for assessing shared costs?
The short answer is no. The slightly longer answer is that, the way that the city process works at this time, that indeed there is not something in place for a development like this to go back and to recover the portion of the cost a portion of the traffic that contributed to that intersection. And as my boss already used this term before me, the lack of impact fees, that is one option that, could be available to the city in the future, is not available at this time. But the point being that there are no transportation impact fees, so there is not a fee to be paid by this developer, or frankly by any developer, past or current, where money would be, for example, put aside for a future signal.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Mr. Chair, if I can just add, at the time the PUD was contemplated, there was a traffic analysis done. So they did look at anticipated traffic volumes at that time, and there is a development agreement associated with this planned unit development. I don't have a map that shows the entire planned unit development of Silver Oak. And within that development agreement is language regarding traffic improvements at the intersections with Carson Street. So as part of the bigger project, it was contemplated, and I believe the language of the development agreement, if I remember correctly, says that as the commercial sites are developed, they bore the responsibility of producing their own traffic analysis.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Sadler.
If the one we approved down south, where there was not on-street parking, because you can't park on the street by the theater. Okay, anyway, I was just asking, if there were not on-street parking here, how many additional parking spaces would be required? Roughly.
One for every 2 units, so 75.
Mr. Salerno.
I thought that the existing parking requirement in the city of Carson City was 2 parking spaces per unit.
If you read that, that division of the development standards, what it says before you get to the hard numbers is that the community development director has the authority to assign a different standard upon the applicant demonstrating from a legitimate source like the Institute of Transportation Engineers that different standard would be acceptable. So we've had this a lot actually, but we definitely had it in Carson Hills Apartments down by the Fandango where that was approved at 1.7. This one, they did seek to use the ITE standard, and the code specifically cites the ITE standard as an acceptable standard. They were seeking 1.2, and we did not accept that, but given we had just accepted the 1.7 down south for a similar apartment complex, we accepted 1.7.
Okay. The ITE rate of which I believe that is a nationwide a number. That's what they have determined nationwide. Is that correct?
That's correct, and then they also break it down between urban areas and suburban areas.
Yeah. I just wonder if that's really appropriate for Carson City. That's one of my concerns.
Which is why I didn't accept the 1.2. And in my conversations with the architect, he was citing examples in what I considered far more urbanized areas than Carson. So I agree with you that, what's good in Portland, Oregon may not be what works in Carson.
Or San Diego or Reno.
Agreed, but I believe 1.7 is a reasonable standard given documentation we've seen on other apartment complexes where we've agreed on 1.7.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Would the applicant care to do a presentation?
Thank you for the opportunity to pontificate here in front of you as an architect. Oh, I got to turn it on? I'm not loud enough?
There should be a button right there. Yeah, it's on. So you've read the staff report and the conditions of approval and those are acceptable?
Yes. As the applicant, and I'm representing our developers here, Dean Castlebaum and Chris Pereira. We have our traffic engineer here as well, can answer more questions for you. But long story short, I know everyone's going to get tired pretty soon. We have read all the conditions, and we're fine with all of them. There's a few modifications that we've talked about with planning to add a few windows to dress up the exterior facades. Engineering has asked us to step back to a couple of parking stalls near the street to allow for safer egress and access. And what else was it? Oh, yes, and on the inside of our site plan, we need to, I would say, broaden out the radius for the fire trucks to go through. We did vet this project extremely well. We thought we read the codes very carefully. We were never asked to do something that wasn't allowed by code, and if it wasn't, we tried to figure out a solution for it that was workable. I highly admire the staff that you have here through engineering and through traffic, through the planning department, to help guide us and make sure that we're aware of what we could not do. They didn't tell us what we could do. We had to find that out ourselves. But we enjoy the process. I'd like to speak a little bit about the ITE. I'm just an architect, and I didn't know much about it, so I tried to read up on it to see what I could come up with. And I didn't get very far, so I asked Paul to help us out. But the long and short of it is the ITE was founded to be concurrent with socialization and traffic patterns, from the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And a lot of people use cars a lot more often now, but the roads are much highly improved. One of the things that came to my mind in using the ITE was comparing it to the Carson City standard of two spaces for each unit, and that's for either a one-bedroom or a two-bedroom unit. The end result on this, I guess this has been in effect for 30 or 40 years in Carson City, has it not, for the parking standard? No, 2002. Well, one of the things that we were trying to avoid is over-parking our development so that we could devote more of it to open space. We're trying to minimize and become green as much as we can to give us ourselves natural land cover and not have to lay down any excess asphalt that might be necessary. So that was our point of view. And the other point of view I wanted to point out is that we've taken a lot of care to try to capture some of the historical heritage here in Carson City. That's why we're using some of the materials that have been around for 100 years, the board and batten siding, corrugated metal roofing, metal siding, a little touch of cobblestone brick here and there. But we think it's important to, where we're at, on the northern gateway to Carson City, is to introduce people to what the heritage of Carson City is, the Western culture, the railroads, and what have you. I'm open for any questions if you'd like to ask anything in particular.
Okay, Mr. Sattler.
On the parking situation, is it only going to be resident parking only inside the facility?
Yes.
Okay, so they couldn't use around the clubhouse, people couldn't come in
No.
public in there? Residents only, okay.
Residents only.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Salerno.
Thank you. I've noticed that there's 3-story buildings and there are no elevators. It's strictly a walk up the stairs to the 3rd floor. This is an upscale part of town, I believe. And I just wonder, while it certainly doesn't violate any codes to do that, I would think an awful lot of people would not like to have a 3rd-story unit where you had to walk up. Secondly, I'm very concerned about the amount of parking that you have. I understand what the ITE recommends, but this is Carson City, and it seems like just about everybody I know or see, they have at least 2 cars, you know, per single family. And this being an upscale area where he goes to work and she goes to work also, and they have 2 cars generally for that. I'm concerned about that.
That's a valid concern, but one of the things that our project does present is its location is very close to public transit, for one item. And number 2, it's difficult to ascertain who's going to be traveling at what times of the day. I know that working families don't usually go to work at the same time. A lot of times, at least I know in my family, the wife works at night, husband works in the day, or vice versa, or they overlap. And that takes a little bit of the pressure off, too. I can't speak to that. That's only, you know, an observation. As far as the walk-ups, I think the views from up there are going to be spectacular. And there's going to be some young upwardly professionals that are going to be parking their bikes down at the bottom and racing up those stairs, you know, to watch the Giants game or something like that. Elevators are a great convenience, but they're also a great expense, and they're a huge maintenance item. If we were to go 1 more story, we would be required to put in elevators, most likely. So we're just going to forego that and let everyone enjoy the open air and get their exercise. Now, if I was moving there, or you, Daniel, we would want a place on the 1st floor.
Absolutely. But I really prefer a top level.
Well, cross your fingers. In a few years, there's probably going to be drone transportation for single users. Anything else?
Okay. Mr. Sattler.
Also, along that line with the location, you know, the school, the college is right there. You're going to have probably quite a mix of age groups, et cetera, using the facilities.
Yes, we see that. We see the doctors and the nurses making use of that facility, some of the students, the college professors. We actually see, we're contemplating doing one special apartment building near the pool that's close to Glen Eagles for government employees, legislators in specific.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It's a lot shorter distance. They can walk instead of drive home.
Don't need a car.
You don't need a car.
Mr. Borders.
Is there any thought to gating it? Gating it. Is there any thought to gating it?
I don't think we've given much thought to gating. We are going to be providing an egress only or access only to the fire department. And by the way, they're the ones that pointed out to us that Silver Oak was not going to have any parking on it. And we talked about trying to get a write-off only. But the gate solves all of our life safety issues with the fire department. That is a gate we will provide. But as far as gating the entrances, we haven't given that much consideration. I think it's an issue of the transient nature of the use of the apartments and what you do with the keys and the cards, and it creates an awful lot of issues. Plus, it's another mechanical item that will not only fail, but probably when you least expect it.
Thank you.
Okay. I guess there are no further questions. I will open it up to the public for their comments and concerns.
Good evening. My name is Randy Kuchenmeister. I own the commercial building located at 3860 GS Richards Boulevard, so directly across the street from the development. Operated my business out of there for the past 16 years. So very familiar with the site. Now my first question is actually for Ms. Sullivan. We had an email exchange on Friday. I specifically asked about the on-street parking, and the direct response from you was that you were not supporting it and there would be none. So what's changed since Friday?
Yeah. If you'll just ask your questions, and then we'll get them answered all at once.
Okay. So that's my first question. I mean, I was specifically told by Ms. Sullivan, I asked about the on-street parking in reading the packet.
Mm-hmm.
She asked me to point out where in the packet that was, and emailed me back that she did not support on-street parking. And so this is different. So that's my first question, and then I'll go on from there.
Go ahead.
Okay. So secondarily, my understanding is this is a secondary emergency access for the hospital. Once the hospital was built, it was nice for us because our street is plowed very quickly when it snows, and I was always of the presumption that that was the reason for it. If it is in fact necessary to have one space per 2 units for guest parking at peak guest parking hours, I cannot imagine that GS Richards Boulevard can accommodate up to that level of on-street parking. And the discussion in the packet was only on the east side. So if you go from the roundabout north to Silver Oak Drive, I just can't imagine that we won't have guest parking on both. They'll be on both sides of the street and in our parking lots. And so I'd like that addressed. I just really don't see how all of that guest parking can end up on GS Richards Boulevard without having some real traffic flow problems at peak guest times. And then lastly, regarding the traffic studies, and all I can go off of is what I've observed for the past 16 years, but as the community college has grown at the peak time of entering and exiting the college, getting off of GS Richards Boulevard onto College Parkway can take a significant amount of time for one vehicle. And so I think we're really going to exacerbate the traffic problems getting onto College Parkway when the college is having large let out of class or going into class at those times of days. I think lots of the folks that work in around GS Richards Boulevard avoid that intersection at those peak times. And then I guess my final comment would be that the Silver Oak Drive entrance onto Carson Street at rush hour is already a dicey situation. I live in Reno, worked here for all this time, so I'm a left turn, and it is dicey, but I think adding a lot more peak traffic there is going to be interesting to see the level of chances people take to get out into that traffic flow. Those are my comments.
Thank you. Actually, let's yeah, we'll take all the comments and we'll try to condense them because there most likely are going to be some overlap.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman. My name is Mark Turner, for the record. I'm the representative of Silver Oak Development Company, which is the company that originally developed the entire PUD, including the piece of ground that's under discussion tonight. I also have a special use permit for an apartment complex across the street from this property, and we had a lot of these similar discussions, as you may remember, a short while back. Overall, I think that Mr. Rose and his associates have done a great job of designing the property. It has a lot of attractive features to it. And as time has gone by, we've found in the Silver Oak commercial area that the original types of commercial uses that we had anticipated at the time the project was originally designed are obsolete and archaic. You know, the dawn of the internet has really changed retail and on office to some extent as well. However, we never really anticipated this heavy of a use along G.S. Richards Boulevard. And while I think the apartments are probably a needed housing product and they're well designed, we do not support the concept of street parking on G.S. Richards Boulevard, and for the same reasons that Mr. Kuchenmeister identified earlier. The street parking will really be, first and foremost, from a planning standpoint, will be a very unattractive thing to see a large amount of cars parked along the street. We all know what happens when cars park along the street. There's a lot of oil dripped on the side of the road. There's also obstructions when it comes time to plowing those streets in the wintertime, and this winter was a very good example of how much snow can accumulate on the side of the road. So from Silver Oak Development standpoint, we don't object to the apartment complex at all. We think it's attractive, but we do very much so object to street parking along G.S. Richards Boulevard. We think that's a bad deal. We think it's unattractive, and we think it's going to be problematic going forward. And that's the sum of my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else from the public who wishes to address this item? Okay, we will. Mr. Salegi.
Well, good evening. For the record, I'm Paul Salegi. I prepared the traffic study and also did the parking review. In terms of the traffic study, specifically at the onset, we visited with traffic staff, city traffic staff, and got the scope of work for the traffic study. They outlined the things they wanted us to study. We analyzed those intersections, the traffic that our project would generate. We were looking out to the distant future year and doing all those things. We analyzed it according to standard procedures, and the findings of our report were that the levels of service, the way traffic engineers measure intersections, were that the intersections all operated acceptably. And so, and even the situation about the signal there on North Carson Street at Silver Oak, the levels of service did not trigger the need that would be considered as a needed improvement even out at the distant future year. And so the levels of service will be met. You want your roadway network to serve the traffic that you're going to aim at it, but you don't want to over-design it. Then you have more pavement to maintain and so forth. So there is value in keeping the roadway improvements so they match the demands that you're creating. And this analysis showed that there was sufficient roadway capacity, intersection capacity there to serve. In terms of the parking, I have had a long traffic engineering career. I'm getting old. I'm doing more parking variance work now than I've really ever done in my career. And what's happening is, my opinion of this is that there is an effort to try and determine what is the appropriate amount of parking. That these codes have been in place in many cases for a long time. And so there's an effort to try and determine, is this really the right amount of parking? The Institute of Transportation Engineers recognizes their documents are highly respected, and the parking manual that we use is now in the 4th edition, that it's been updated 4 times, trying to hone in and stay current with the changes in land use. So our findings were that we were trying to use the best available data based on city code to justify the parking numbers. The final point would be this on-street parking. The street by city code, it is acceptable to park there. And so for those reasons, that parking is utilized. So again, we feel that we have a responsible application and it's supported by city code. So I'd be happy to discuss any specific points that you have that you'd like me to cover more fully, but we feel that we have a responsible application on the table. Thank you.
Okay. You might want to hold on for a second. Ms. Green.
Well, he's the man I'd talk to. I just have a quick question. I don't know if you guys could do this or if it was possible, but in the traffic studies, was any account taken for the completion of the other complex that's right across the street?
We did not specifically analyze individual projects, but in that cumulative analysis, that was based on the Carson City Master Plan, the future year modeling. And so that's based on an absorption of future developments. And so future growth in the area has been considered in the study.
Okay. I have had some experience at the intersection of G.S. Richards and College Parkway, and I'm wondering, and it seems to me, and this is just my own observation, that it's more a issue of the striping and the way the striping forces traffic to go in around there, because it's on a curve, and then you've got the 2 lanes at the Save Mart coming down to 1 lane, and I'm wondering if that might contribute to some of the difficulty of getting through that intersection, and it can be difficult when you've got cars coming down College Parkway at 45 miles an hour.
I viewed this intersection myself to make sure that we understood the situation. I think the transition with the two westbound lanes transitioning into 1 lane, that causes the traffic to be congested. There's no question there's a large volume of traffic. I believe the peak hour, evening peak hour volume, 900 cars an hour. That's a significant volume. However, the volumes on G.S. Richards are not that large, and the levels of service still served were met adequately. And so despite there's a large volume of traffic on College Parkway, we were able to meet the levels of service. There were sufficient gaps to serve that with appropriate delay. Now, it's not that you could come up there and immediately make the turn. You'd have to wait a period of time. But the amount of time that the delay was imposed on those side street cars was still within city policy.
Okay. Mr. Sattler.
Well, just from my observation, if I were living there and we're going south, I would come out, head up to Silver Oak Drive and make a right and come that way rather than trying to come out on College Parkway.
I concur with that. There is an excellent roadway network here, and there are, and perhaps even this mention about the college physically, the college campus attracting traffic during certain peak hours. I think residents will be able to do that, route around. Maybe you'd come in one way and depart another way, depending based on the peak hours or the congestion. So as a resident, it would be different here than if you were a person just visiting a business, and we'd be less familiar with those kind of day-to-day fluctuations. So I think the fact that the good street network that's being provided, that gives you the ability to divert some if you need. If you're sensitive to that, sensitive to making a left turn at a congested intersection. Well,
one last question. Are there 75 on-street parking spaces between the roundabout and Silver Oak Drive?
I did not specifically measure those distances. I don't know that myself right now. I would have to check.
I know that there are several driveway cuts in there, and I'm just wondering how limited that might be. But you have to meet that requirement. You have to be able to show that you've got 75 parking spaces. So I'm going to, no?
There's only 30.
They don't have.
When you're ready, when you're done talking to Mr. Salegi, I'm happy to go through the parking requirements with you.
I think we're all done, Mr. Salegi. Thank you.
Very much.
Anybody else? Public comment?
Is there anyone else from public who wishes to address this item? I thought I had already asked that, but, yeah. But anyway, we'll bring it back, we'll close the public comment portion, and bring it back to the commission for further discussion. Ms. Sullivan, would you like to address these issues that have been brought forward?
Yes. First, the gentleman who spoke first, he and I did email back and forth, and I was surprised when he emailed and said, I'm reading that it says they're going to park on the street. I was like, what? They're not, because we had talked so much. I had talked so much to the applicant about the parking standard because they wanted the 1.2. I wasn't, Paul Seleggi did a report saying 1.2. The code, I'm going to read to you, so I'm not summarizing. I'm reading the code, okay? The code says, if an accredited source, example, Institute of Transportation Engineers, provides an acceptable alternative to a parking standard in this division, the director may consider the alternative. That's right here in our code. So although the code says the number 2, it also says we can consider alternatives. Well, between the time this project had an NPR and they were proposing a really low parking standard that I was not willing to support, Carson Hills comes in with a bunch of documentation justifying 1.7 spaces per unit. That's a 300-unit apartment complex. So I said, well, wow, this is convincing, 1.7 spaces per unit. So we brought the Carson Hills to the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission supported Carson Hills apartment complex, and I called Ken Rose. I said, I can support 1.7. We just supported 1.7 on a different apartment complex. Okay, now.
Before you go any
yes,
further,
yes.
let me, does the 1.7 include guest parking?
Yes.
Okay, that's where I got confused, because I was hearing,
Okay, now
I
I'm
was
going to talk
hearing
about
that guest parking was separate.
Okay, so what the code says, the first thing we read in the code is somebody can come up with a different number and a different standard, and the community development director will consider that alternative standard. If you don't have an alternative standard, you're supplying 2 spaces per dwelling with an asterisk. Okay, so we have to read our asterisk. Okay, so I'm going to read to you. I'm not even summarizing. In developments where internal or abutting public streets are reduced to less than the standard street width, thereby prohibiting on-street parking, 1 additional off-street parking space per 2 units shall be designated and shall be signed as guest parking within 300 feet, measured by walking distance of the units they serve. So I remember I read this with Ken Rose sitting right in my office. Ken Rose left, got a tape measure, measured the street, came back, said, I just measured the street. Am I allowed to park on that street? Is it wide enough for on-street parking? We sent him down the hall to talk to engineering. Engineering did their own measurement and concluded that, yes, this street does accommodate on-street parking for anybody. It can be you, it can be me, it can be anybody. It's a public street. So I read my rule. My rule says where the internal or abutting streets are reduced to less than the standard street width, thereby prohibiting on-street parking. I stop reading. This rule is no longer applicable because we have on-street parking adjacent to the site. So I apologize to the gentleman who spoke first because I thought I was clear on this, but it's kind of hard to explain. You can read it and understand it, and you can apply it, but to kind of explain it in an email can be challenging. I guess I didn't do a good job of it.
So how many parking spaces are on site, off the street? So they meet the parking requirement on the site?
On site, the parking provided is 1.7 spaces per unit. So it's 1.7 times 150.
And that calculation includes guest parking, so.
Exactly.
So they meet, if we decide that 1.7 is the appropriate number, then they will have met the parking standard.
Correct.
On site.
Except that the developer stated here tonight that there was going to be no guest parking inside the facility.
Right.
And that's the first time I heard that, and I was actually very surprised to hear that because I've never heard of that prohibition.
Because that
He's going to come up and clarify that too. So I'm going to try to link. I'm going to try to link the misunderstanding with this. And the summary of this is, they are providing the required parking on site. On-street parking is permitted today and in the future, and is not being decided by this development. It is just on-street parking is already permitted on that street, and they are meeting the parking requirement on site. And I'm not sure he should clarify that. I don't think he meant that they're going to prohibit guest parking on site. But he can clarify that.
And that's why I asked, because I saw by Building G in the clubhouse, there's a bunch, maybe someone could come in there and park or whatever if they were visiting or something. That's why I asked that.
May I? Ken Rose again. We don't have any designated specific spots that we label for guest parking. So basically, it encompasses all parking. So in reference to that question, I hope to stand to clarify that. We're not labeling it. We have labels for compact cars and handicap spaces.
But guests will be able to enter the site and park on
yes.
site.
Yes,
see,
absolutely.
I think that's where the confusion.
Yeah, that's where you threw, I'm sorry. That's why I had asked that, because I saw by the clubhouse and everything, there's lots of parking that, during the day, someone could park there, go visit, whatever. But you had said it was going to be resident parking only inside.
Well, and they're guests. I mean, if you're not going there to visit anybody and you just want to camp out and use your iPhone, no.
Mr. Salerno.
Mr. Rose.
Yes, sir.
I had lost my train of thought for a moment. Will you have reserved parking spaces? In other words, if you rent a particular unit, do you get a specific parking space with nobody else allowed to use that parking space?
Yes.
Covered parking.
I'm sorry that I heard that. Because
there's a reason for it.
Yeah, they're covered parking by your apartment.
No, there's no covered.
Hi, thank you. Chris Pereira, I'm part of the development team. The only ones that will be assigned are the ones that are in front of storage units. And I think we have 45. You can rent a storage unit, so you will be assigned that parking place in front of that storage unit. All the rest are open for whomever, first come, first serve.
Okay, I think that's very important because, when we think about parking and where people live, sometimes people are away on vacation. They're not there. Sometimes they work at night, sometimes they work at day. So if there are open parking spaces, there's usually such a rotation of cars that you can get by with fewer parking spaces as a result of that. I've been involved with some other projects where, that was a very, very important factor, that people don't really, as long as it's not reserved specifically, all of the spaces for somebody, that there is a possibility for, if somebody's gone, anybody else can park in those other open spaces.
Open game.
And when I came to this meeting very concerned about the parking until I remembered and realized that factor, that there's a rotation of people who park in a place like that. And because of that, you can get by with a lot fewer parking spaces. So I think maybe in that, the engineering report, they probably take that into consideration, because it's a very in-depth study, I'm sure, that when they came up with the, 1.23 spaces, they take that probably into consideration. So I feel better about the parking.
Okay.
Thank you.
You bet.
Okay, are there any further questions or discussion on this item?
We're back to us.
Yes, we are.
I have one
Okay.
question with staff, I think. When we look at these projects and we look at the parking that's required, every one of these apartment complexes, and this is the third one I've looked at, have places for trash pickup and dumpsters. Do we look at how they have placed those and traffic flows and how they park? Because this is also the third one I've seen where the damn garbage truck can't get to the dumpster that they've drawn. They're all backwards. And I don't know, I know that's a problem for the developer, but I don't know when we look at all the traffic that we're talking about, if we ever consider what the waste management's gonna look at.
Yeah. I guess two things. One, when I look at plans initially, I often will say to the applicant, where's all the bad stuff? Where are you putting your dumpsters? Because sometimes I don't even see dumpsters, so I ask for dumpsters at that point. When we get to the construction plan level and they're trying to work out the contract with Waste Management or whoever is going to pick up their trash, they then refine the location so the trash truck can get in there and do it. But it's funny because I almost forgot, and I was talking to the applicant just during your break right before this item. He said, did you solve your trash problem? And I was puzzled for a minute. Then I remembered, we talked about trash a lot during the NPR on this one. So you're right, dumpsters take up a lot of space, and planning for the correct location of them is really important, and the right number of them.
All right, well, somewhere along the way it gets considered. I'm done.
Okay. You were ready to make a motion?
I'll make a motion.
Okay.
I move to approve SUP-17-048, a request from Ken Rose, property owner, Gold Lot Corporation, for a special use permit to allow multifamily apartments on property zoned retail commercial plan unit development, RC-P, on property located on the southeast corner of GS Richards Boulevard and Silver Oak Boulevard, APN 007-461-19, based on the ability to make the required findings in the affirmative as stated in the staff report and subject to conditions of approval.
Okay, we have a motion. Is there a second?
I'll second again.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? I would just like to reiterate or to say that I feel that that based upon the parking findings, and that was really the only issue that I heard brought up concerning this project, that item has been addressed sufficiently to be able to make the findings in the required by the ordinance. So with that, I will ask for a vote on the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Passes unanimously with one absent. Thank you very much.
Yeah, once we got that it wasn't locked up
Yeah.
parking.
Okay, moving on. Staff reports. Mr. Plemmel.
Thank you. Just quickly, actually don't have anything on the plate to report from the last Board of Supervisors meeting, but let me just cover the next meetings briefly. We have a shorter agenda next month coming up, which includes a special use permit for Fritch Middle School expansion, a little bit of their planned improvements there, special use permit for a front yard fence, special use permit for expansion of a medical marijuana establishment, and a special use permit for for a daycare facility, for an existing daycare facility, actually just a transfer of ownership. The other thing I wanted to mention is, it looks like this is going to be Ms. Green's last meeting with us tonight after her one term. She has decided not to reapply, and the Board of Supervisors are going to be interviewing tomorrow. She's going to keep busy, but I want to thank her for her term here. She's done a great job. We loved having her on the Planning Commission.
Well, and thank you all. I have learned quite a bit from each and every one of you. I am I was only working part-time, I'm going back to full-time, and I am going back to school, so this was just not going to fit for a couple years.
Come back.
So I have enjoyed it. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
And
She
I'm
has us,
hoping that
or
we
she has us
have an adequate pool of candidates, especially women candidates,
There
to
are
fill
four
that.
with one lady.
And we have
So-
new members next month?
Yeah, well, the members are meeting tomorrow, the interview's at 2, right after lunch tomorrow, 2 openings.
So when do we do the elections and stuff in July,
Next
is
month.
that correct? Or June?
Yeah, it's often, I think it's scheduled, I'll look at the bylaws to make sure. I think it's July, and that,
Terms
it
end
often
in
just
June.
depends on the scheduling with the executive offices of when the changeover occurs. So I think we intentionally put it July in the bylaws to make sure we had the new planning commissioner on board.
Okay,
I'll look at that, though.
okay. Ms. Sullivan, you have anything? Engineering? Engineering? Nothing?
Sure.
District attorney?
Nope.
Okay.
I just,
Any commissioners?
well, yeah, the terms expire in 6, and then we have the elections after the new term starts, so it'd be in 7, we have the election.
Any commissioners have anything? Okay, seeing none, meeting's adjourned. Oh, I forgot. Meeting's not reopened. One final possibility for public comment. Anyone wishing to address the commission? Going once?
Okay.
Meeting's adjourned.